Dr. Matt Hitchcock, who's a postdoc here at Leicester on the New History of Bronze project. But today he's going to talk about his PhD work on Iron Age shields.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks so much for coming, everyone. I'm Matt. As Kate said, I'm a postdoctoral researcher on the Rachel's Crellin's New History of Bronze. I'm working with my incredible colleagues David Sif and Christina Chiraki, who've been great to work with, and Rachel as PI and Ollie as collaborator. So it's been already a wonderful time since I've joined the department at Leicester in October. Right, yeah, I've done a bit now, but I'm not going to be talking about that today. This talk draws heavily on the work I did for my PhD thesis at the University of Manchester, which I finished a couple of years ago. I studied under the wonderful Melanie Giles, who's an ex-Leicester staff member, of course, and alongside Emma Tollefson on the Body Politics project as well. So I'll give you a brief history of shield use in British prehistory. I'll show you some key shield types and case studies and talk about how I tackled the problematic issue of typology with Iron Age shields. And I'll also draw out some of the key themes that emerge from this study, such as the interplay between materials, texture, form, colour, and the relationship between natural and artificial forms, as well as art and decoration, and how that relates to acts of violence. So, the story starts with these two shields, the Tarian on the left and the Ysgwyd on the right. These were the original names given to them by their first owner, Samuel Merrick, who acquired them in the late 1820s. He was a collector of arms and armour and housed his collection at Goodrick Court in Herefordshire, a large stately home that stood over the Welsh border. Tarian means something like clasher, and Merrick drew the word Ysgwyd from a 6th century poem. And it's actually a Welsh corruption of a Latin word for shield, scutum, which we now use mainly to refer to Roman-style shields. It's us scuta, us guida. So this was several decades before Thomson and Warside's three-age system becomes mainstream. So before the notion of a Stone Age, a Bronze Age, and an Iron Age. And it's also long before any British prehistoric art is referred to as being Celtic. So it's pre-Celtic art. And in a letter he wrote in 1831, he describes them simply as being excellent examples of the armour of the native pre-Roman Britons. They're actually about 700 years apart in terms of age. The Tarian is a Bronze Age one and the Ysgwyd is an Iron Age one, but I'll talk a bit more about that later. So after Merrick's death, they go on display at South Kensington Museum, which is now part of the V&A, in 1869. It's part of a major exhibition of weapons and armour from cultures around the world. So this is Merrick's lovely line drawing of the two shields with larger decoration from the Ysgwyd. And this is an engraving from the Illustrated Times showing the exhibition. So they were tucked into the first alcove near the entrance. Standing before it, a visiting journalist remarked, "To turn from this case and look down the entire length of the gallery is to be carried back in association and ideas to days when the term fighting had a severely personal application." That's lovely, isn't it? So presenting them very much as the arms of a technologically and artistically skilled but warlike pre-Roman people. After this, they pass via Augustus Franks into the care of the British Museum, where they are now. The Tarian now has the less snappy name Bronze Age shield from Moel Hebog, and the Ysgwyd became more commonly known as the Witham shield after the river that it was found. They've both been exhibited and studied extensively during the 2 centuries that they've been known to the modern world, but shifts in academic and popular interests have changed the way that they've been perceived since this early exhibition. The emergence of the study of Celtic art and ancient art more generally, particularly with the Witham shields, has led them to be appreciated for their aesthetic value and seen as ceremonial or display pieces rather than shields that would have actually been used in battle. And it was this was one of the main questions that led me to want to study shields, other than being kind of beautiful objects, of course. So let me give you the full story. So shields first emerge in the Bronze Age, in the first half of the 2nd millennium BC. They accompany a range of new one-hand cutting and thrusting weapons. The sword first emerges about 1600 BC, for example, and the shield served as a defensive measure which you could hold in the other hand. So these are a few examples. This one's called a Yetome type shield. This is the Tarian, which is from Wales, but there's also examples from Scotland and England. We've got about 30 of these now, so large, circular, made from bronze. A new one was discovered in Oxfordshire not too long ago, and all but one of them come from Britain, so this is a very British type. The middle one's called this one's called a nipper vise. A few of these are from Germany, one from Poland, and a couple of them are from the UK. This one's from Oxfordshire. And we've also got a couple of organic examples as well. So this is the Clonbryn shield from Ireland. And as you can see, this one's been kind of perhaps more obviously used than the other two. It's kind of got some cuts to the edge there. So it's clear that the organic examples that we have saw use. They are punctures from swords and spears, cuts along the edge. But were the metal ones used as well, or were they more for show? Kind of facsimiles of the organic ones. Well, starting in the early 1960s, John Coles ran some tests to see how the metal ones perform. I love this picture. I feel like we should recreate this at some point during the project. He carefully reproduced some of the first replica leather shields and found that they performed really well. The corrugation acted as decoration, but also support and added strength to the shield as well. But when he reproduced and tested some bronze ones, he found that they were too thin and worked less well compared to the leather ones. The bronze sword just kind of ripped straight through it. However, Barry Malloy in the 2000s revisits this and points out that the alloy that Coles used wasn't quite right, and also that he made the replicas way too thin, that they were only about 1/3 as thick as they should have been. So Barry Malloy ran some new tests using the metal replicas that better matched the thickness of the originals and had proper rolled rims, and found that they did indeed match and even exceeded the performance of their organic counterparts, and argued that it was completely plausible that they were used in battle. However, he did argue at the same time that that shouldn't take away from the metal shield symbolism, and that they referenced a well-understood martial reality. In other words, some bronze shields have evidence of violent use and others don't. But the key thing is that they could be used in battle for violence. So this kind of either-or approach kind of misses the point a little bit. And David and myself will be studying Bronze Age shields as part of the Bronze Project at National Museum Scotland, and hopefully elsewhere over the coming months. So stay tuned for more Bronze Age shield research. So after the Late Bronze Age, about 1900 BC, something like that, the tradition of bronze shield making seems to completely disappear from Britain. And there are no shields surviving at all dating to the next 500 years or so. This isn't to say that shield use fell out of tradition altogether. The organic ones very probably remained in use, although at the same time, it's not completely out of the realm of possibility that established martial traditions completely fall out of use. For example, archery as a tradition completely disappears after the Bronze Age, and there's no archery in the Iron Age at all. Javelins and slings are pretty much the only ranged weapons that they use. But I do think that in the case of shields, they probably still made and used the organic versions. When shields reappear in the archaeological record from about 400, 350 BC, they look much different from the circular Bronze Age ones, and there's much more variation. This slide gathers together just a selection of examples, and you can see the level of diversity. So these are all from the Iron Age. So they're really diverse in terms of form. They're really diverse in terms of materials. They range from completely organic. The wooden shield there was, of course, excavated by our lovely colleagues at ULAS. And they range all the way to completely made of metal and kind of everything in between. So they're really hard to categorize, to typologize, to make sense of them. And this is probably why they haven't received the same treatment as things like swords and spears and mirrors that have had full monograph length publications that have produced typologies to kind of make sense of them. People have been scared to do it really because it's like really difficult. So this is one of the things that I had to tackle with my PhD, try and find out, devise a system that will help us kind of categorize new examples and make sense of the ones that we already have. So I took an assemblage-based approach, which was rooted in post-humanism and new materialism. Hooray! And this allowed me to take a different approach, particularly when it came to typology and materials. A disproportionate amount of attention had been paid to the bronze shields and the bronze parts of shields. So it allowed me to take a more democratic approach to the importance of non-metal materials as well, and explore the affordances of and significance of organics. Iron Age shields were quite complicated assemblages of components that could be removed, repaired, damaged, and replaced. And to fit them into a system that classifies them as discrete objects kind of crystallizes them in one particular configuration. So I wanted to reframe the shield not just as an object in isolation, but to explore and take into account the material changes that it could go through over time. I wanted to create a system that could account for fragmented fittings as well as complete shields, and also shields that may have had bosses removed and replaced and things like that. So this is a little bit of a hectic slide, but I created kind of like a component-based typology, a bit of a mix and match from 3 categories. So first of all, you have the 3 board shapes, and pretty much every shield that we have falls into one of these 3 categories. It would be oval, it would be sub-rectangular, or it would be high-shaped. The middle category is the boss. This is the bit that immediately covers the hole in the shield, usually made of wood, but occasionally made of metal and attached directly to the boards. And then the third category is the one where we get the most variation, and this is the boss cover, sometimes called an umbo. So made of metal, but a piece that attaches directly over the boss to provide more strength and more stability and balance to the shield as well as more opportunity for decoration. This is just another bit of shield anatomy. So this is just a kind of made up shield to illustrate the different parts. So we've got the boards, the main body of the shield, sometimes it's called, the boss in the middle, the boss cover that goes over the top. Some shields have this, some don't. And then on the back, well, we have the edge binding that goes around the outside, and this stops the shield from splitting, but may also have offensive potential as well. The back was often padded with leather or rawhide. Again, for strength, but kind of comfort if the shield was being carried or kind of worn. And then we have the handle, and often these are quite kind of ergonomically placed, a slight slant, so it would be comfortable to hold the shield in the hand. So if I'm talking about the different shield bits, this is what I mean. This is a distribution map of all the sites in England and Wales that have produced shield remains. So there's a general kind of southeasterly distribution. There's a big cluster of burials up in East Yorkshire where we have a lot of cemeteries. Many of them are from hill fort sites, but those tend to be kind of the more fragmented pieces. The most well-preserved metal examples often come from rivers or kind of wetland contexts. And we get the occasional bit of shield in hoards as well. My data set actually, I mean, in terms of number, there were less than 100 entries after I'd collected together all of the shield remains from England and Wales. So in terms of a size of a data set, it's relatively small for a PhD. But what it makes up for in number, what it lacks in numbers, it makes up for in richness, because many of these shields are really complicated assemblages of dozens of different components and lots of different materials. So there was lots that I could kind of go off and draw out. These are all of the bronze faced Iron Age shields that we have. So I'll just talk you through these. So this is the only one that we have that's completely made of metal. Well, actually, that's not quite true, because the core of the handle is made from ash, but everything else is made from metal. This one was found in the Thames at Chertsey, or an old course of the Thames. This is the iconic Battersea shield that you might well know. It's often the poster boy. It's often adorns book covers about Celtic art or kind of Iron Age weapons and stuff like that. There's a big kind of billboard of it in the Great Court at the British Museum. This next one, the round one, was the central boss of a shield that looked like the Battersea shield, probably. You can see it's the middle bit of this. This is a boss from also from the Thames at Wandsworth, the best borough of London where I used to live. There's a bit of wear to that one as well, a bit of repair. This one, we've got the Ysgwyd, the Witham shield. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but this was found in the River Trent. Next, we have the again, the kind of central boss of a shield that probably would have looked a bit like this. I'll go into more detail about that in a second. This one's also from a river, Ratcliffe on Soar. Next, we have a boss that's often referred to informally as sad fish-faced man. This was, again, the central boss that probably would have had kind of circular attachments to it. And then the one at the end is probably one that you haven't seen before. It hasn't been published, and it's not in my PhD data set. This one's actually in a private collection in the continent somewhere. But it's, I mean, in my money, it certainly was produced in the UK. It's very much of the British style. This tradition of bronze face shields was a uniquely British thing. Whether the circumstances of its discovery, we don't know. Whether it was produced in Britain and then it left in antiquity, or whether it left Britain in modernity, we don't know. Another researcher is currently looking into this one as we speak, so hopefully we might know more about it soon. But I wanted it to be with its siblings, you know. So this one is the shield boss from the River Trent in Nottinghamshire, and it's one of my favourites. It was discovered in 1895, and it was donated to the Leamington Spa Art Gallery and Museum, where it still is. It was originally incorrectly accessioned as horse gear, and there it sat in the museum stores until the early 1990s, when it was recognised as a shield fitting. The gallery have since had it on display from time to time, but it's the only Iron Age object that they have in the collection, so they don't really have the means to contextualise it. So it's currently sitting rather sadly back in the stores again. It was published in 1996, but it's kind of gone under the radar a little bit since then. So you can see it's in 3 broken sections, but it's the it's the central boss of a bronze-faced shield, like the Witham shield. And we know that the shield was once covered in sheet because part of the sheet still clings to one of the rivets that's on the back of the boss there. It's decorated in a style of Celtic art called Valdalgasheim style. It has links with Germany and Hungary, and there are very few British objects that reflect this quite distinctive style. From a river, so no immediate context, but it's probably one of the earlier ones from about 350 BC. The decoration is very flowing and tendrily, and its central boss has a design where the tendrils cross over one another, which is also quite unusual. So the decoration is exotic to this part of England, but it's been amalgamated with the local shield style. So it speaks of the mixing of concepts, the relatedness of different cultural groups across large distances, and how motifs and styles can become bound up with identities in new ways. It's got quite a catalogue of damage and repair. You can see some of it there. So this is an early split to the end of the boss, which has been repaired with kind of like 2 lengths of wire that have been sheared off, almost like a staple. It's got a larger kind of catalogue of damage up at the top part of the boss there. It looks like a sharp implement has kind of like gone in and stabbed it and torn it off. And we've got, this is the lower part of the boss there. We've got another break, but it's also got earlier repair to that break. So it's a mixture of damage that was probably enacted on it just before it was deposited or shortly before it was deposited. Whether this was ritualized damage, whether this was kind of actual damage in warfare, we don't really know, but there's clearly, it's clearly seen some kind of rough use before that as well, because parts of some parts of the damage has been repaired. I'm returning to the decoration. I just wanted to draw attention to the bird or beast-like creatures that are below the terminals on each end. And having animal forms incorporated into the design is a common feature on these more highly decorated shields. These are some other bird and bovine motifs on the Witham shield as well, for context. But Celtic art's very abstract. I'm taking an approach that kind of goes beyond straightforward representation, rather than trying to classify animal forms based on taxonomy. I drew on the work of like Chantal Cornella and Nick Overton to think about animals in terms of effect. How did Iron Age people encounter and experience them? In what ways did they try and harness their effects and apply them to the objects that they used? This particular beast has been called like a bird-beast hybrid, but the parts of it that are being evoked are the beak, the eyes, the claws, and it's the same with the bovine imagery as well. It's the staring eyes. The red parts on the Witham shield there are coral from the Mediterranean. So thinking about these in a non-representational way is useful because although we can infer that they're generally avian or bovine, it's specific parts and specific concepts or behaviours that are being evoked. So Julia Farley, who in her previous role was the curator of the Iron Age collections at the British Museum, and for her sins was also my external examiner, had also done a lot of work on highly decorated objects such as the Witham shield here and the Waterloo helmet. And also found that objects that were said to be purely for ceremonial or display purposes actually often had quite significant instances of damage and repair. So we decided to join forces on a paper that actually exists as a draft now, hooray! And I'll be submitting it for the Material Worlds Masterclass. So the Ysgwyd, the Witham shield here, you can see there's some damage here that this has been kind of pinned back in place. Part of the binding that you can see on one side is missing from the other side. And all down that side, it's been kind of pinned back onto the shield board. So it's got quite a long kind of history of use. It's quite battered when it goes into the river. And then on the right there is the famous horned Waterloo helmet. And people don't often appreciate that it's damaged, but that's because it's on display back to front. This is actually the neck guard at the back. And on the front of the helmet is this like massive gash. And we know that it was enacted in antiquity because there's some attempts at repair there as well. So these are the two objects that form the study of that paper. So, yes, they would have been special. Yes, they would have taken a lot of time and skill to produce. But the notion that things like this meant that they were too precious to be involved in violence is one that's rooted in modern capitalism. The value and power and significance of objects in the past was realised in very different ways. Celtic art was eye-catching, visually arresting, enchanting, frightening, and when mobilised by the shield, it could also be threatening and violent. We might think of some of these more accomplished metal-faced shields as having oral histories attached to them, notoriety, renown. Perhaps they had names and maybe they were even seen as subjects in their own right. All of this made the bronze-faced shield a formidable defensive weapon that could be deployed in both physical and psychological ways. This is another one of my favourite shield types, the hide-shaped shield. This type of shield is another one that's unique to Britain. So in 1985, the story behind this is metal detectorists found a huge hoard in Salisbury, the Salisbury hoard, that contained masses of bronze and Iron Age metalwork. It was initially illicitly divided up, and there was a big police case to bring it back together again. It's a really interesting story, actually. Anyway, but amongst these objects, there was a collection of these amazing little miniature shields that are only about that big. Sorry, people online. Yeah, you can see them. Yeah. So some look very skillfully made. The top left one that I've blown up there, and nicely decorated, and others look a bit more shoddy, like the one in the top right. But really, what really stood out about them at the time was their unusual shape, like a stylized animal hide. There was no doubt as to whether these reflected or represented. Sorry, there was doubt as to whether these reflected full-size shields, because at the time there were no kind of full-sized examples, so we didn't know whether these were, a real object or whether they were just, existed in miniature form. But then a few years later, in the late 80s, a lavish burial from Mill Hill in Deal, Kent, was found, which contained a rather short young man of slightly feminine build. He was buried wearing a fine bronze crown, a sword, and a hide-shaped shield. Very fabulous, in my opinion. The shield had been apparently ritually decommissioned before being placed into the grave, and it was split in half longitudinally and tucked next to the side of the body. And it was a hide-shaped shield, a real full-size hide-shaped shield. So we realised that, when I say we, I mean the royal we. We as archaeologists realised that these miniatures did actually reflect full-size examples. So this was clearly the grave of somebody really important, and it marked the first of many inhumations that began to fill the surrounding cemetery. That's Hannah Sackett's lovely comic of the Mill Hill warrior there. So although the hide-shaped shields are distinctly British, they may have been related to shields from the continent, such as this one from Moserstein in Austria, with a perhaps more overt and naturalistic reference to animal skin incorporated into its form. Here, the central spindle-shaped iron boss, with its long spine, echoes the effect of a raised back ridge of fur and hair. The shape of the organic body of the shield references a processed animal skin, and the object as a whole acts as a skeuomorph as a hide, as it would appear between skinning and the application to an object. The exaggeration of the back ridge perhaps worked to evoke the raised hackles of many animals in a state of anger, fear, or defense. It literally embodied a state of heightened intimidation. So the hide-shaped shields are really interesting in that they incorporate animal hide physically, but they also emphasize the symbolic power of the animal as well. This is just a quick example of a shield that illustrates that kind of mix and match nature of the shield, that you can add things, you can take them away. This one is from Grimthorpe in North Yorkshire. Helen Chittick's done a lot of great work on this. And originally it would have had a central boss that would have covered, would have overlapped the plaques on either side, and it would have overlapped the spine a little bit. But at some point that's been taken off and replaced by this newer plaque in the middle. So the plaques at the side are really quite battered, and you can see quite a marked difference to the newer plaque in the middle. So this is just an example of how shields can, have this kind of mix and match. You can really like nail anything that you want to the front of a shield, but they're kind of customizable assemblages in that way. So, like I said earlier, typology has long been a problem because British shields are so unique and so diverse. But certain later southern bosses can be classified using existing continental typologies. This is an example of Bruneau and Rapin's typology from the sanctuary sites of Gournay and Riedmont in northern France, where there's an abundance of well-stratified shield remains among other weapons. The Celtic sanctuary sites were like these big timber platforms, and there was like bodies that would be kind of put up for display, dead bodies, and there would be weapons that would be deposited there, like really grim and gothy, not literally the Goths, but Iron Age. And this boss, sorry, I keep forgetting I'm talking to archaeologists. And this boss cover or umbo here is from the burial at North Burstead, about 50 BC, of a man who was interred with weapons and a really unusual helmet. He was probably Gaulish originally, but this boss was likely produced in Britain because, unlike the examples from those sanctuary sites, of which we have many, it has distinctive upturned edges, and it was also made from bronze rather than iron. On the continent, most shields were made from iron. There was much more of a bronze tradition in Britain. So this is just to show you a reconstruction of the man from that burial by the Novum Museum in Chichester, where he was on display. I think he still is. And you can see that really unusual, extravagant openwork helmet. It gives you an idea of how long the umbo would have been and how it would have fit over the boss with the spines running underneath. We were invited down, the Novum Museum invited us down to do like a consultancy day for them in preparation for their exhibition of this warrior. I mean, really, they invited the important people and I just tagged along, but this exhibitions and reconstructions like this, I think, really kind of bring this martial panoply to life. But did he really use this stuff? Well, he actually had compression to his upper cervical vertebra, consistent with him riding around wearing a very heavy helmet for a long period of time. So yeah, probably he did. So yeah, moving on. Next, we're going to go over to a site called the Mile Pocklington, which is a fairly recently excavated site, and it's produced some amazing Iron Age chariot burials, one of which you can see here being excavated. It was excavated by MAP, Malton Archaeological Practice. Those who attend the Fieldworkers lecture might have seen Paula Ware give a talk about the chariot burials here at Leicester just before Christmas, I think it was. So in most of Britain and for most of the Iron Age, there was a general absence of formal burial, right? People weren't buried in graves or cemeteries. Rather, they were disposed of in archaeologically invisible ways. They were cremated, they were deposited into rivers, or they were just left out in the open for birds and other animals to take care of. One major exception to this is East Yorkshire, where from the Middle Iron Age onwards, we get large cemeteries of burials, and so a very rich burial record with human remains and grave goods for us to study, which is lovely. The Mile here is one such cemetery. It consisted mainly of square barrows with a few circular barrows as well. And a couple of these burials had pretty impressive shields. Paul invited Mel Giles and myself to come work on these shields as specialists. And it really was just an incredible stroke of luck that these were discovered while I was doing a PhD on shields, which is like brilliant, really convenient. And, it was great to be involved in it, of course. So this first burial is one from one of the round barrows, and it features a skeleton that was sexed osteologically as male, aged between 17 and 25, so fairly young and kind of in the prime of Iron Age life. You can see the shield that's been placed over the top of there has been broken kind of before it's been deposited into the grave. And he's been subjected to something that's called the spearing rite. And this is a well-attested kind of funerary practice in East Yorkshire, where basically the mourners would stand around the side of the grave, and as it's been backfilled, they would chuck their spears into the grave, in and around the corpse, sometimes spearing the corpse. Sometimes it would have a shield over it, so the spears would go through the shield. You can actually see this is one of the iron spearheads here, and it's penetrated the shield boards. So even though the boards don't survive, we can see how thick the organic part of the shield was by how it was preserved on the shield there. This is a practice that's often reserved for people who have died a kind of difficult death, so perhaps a violent death in battle, and it's a very kind of martial send-off. The next burial is one that was really, really special. This is a bit more. So this just shows you how this boss cover kind of overlaps in the middle to it would have overlain the wooden boss. And this is another example, a similar example that we have from a cemetery in Rudston, which is also from East Yorkshire, but this one's made from iron. So they're kind of making similar forms from different materials and experimenting with it in that way. So this is the burial of a man who was at least 46 years old. He died, well, he's probably significantly older actually. He was born locally, but may have spent a significant period abroad before returning to Yorkshire in later life. He was buried in the box of this amazing chariot, buried complete with completely assembled, upright with ponies leading at the front. As the chariot was interred complete and fully assembled, the box would have acted as a kind of surrogate grave in which the body and the grave goods would have been placed and positioned before it was led down into the barrow. This might not have necessarily happened at the graveside, but rather the box may have been prepared elsewhere before being kind of led in a procession down to the cemetery. The first object to be placed into the chariot was a shield. Hooray, this amazing shield. And this created a means to kind of frame and contain the body. This was face down underneath him, acting as a robust base, which fortunately helped preserve the integrity of the body. Probably would have been in a worse condition if it wasn't for this. I'm just going to flick back. He was covered in pig bones. They'd removed them at this point of the excavation, but he really was covered. These were the remains of a funerary feast that probably took place at the graveside. It consisted of piglet bones and a spit or feasting skewer. This might have been an event that was open to a wider demographic of society, or perhaps it was restricted to an exclusive group of mourners, perhaps bound by status, kinship, or role within the community. Certainly, the culling and roasting of several animals would be restricted to special occasions, and this might be seen as an act of veneration. It may have also been an important opportunity for an ambitious individual to gain favour from those present, especially if a power vacuum had emerged. It's also possible that some or even all of the feasting remains represented in this burial were symbolic, intended for the deceased on the journey to the next world, or for the ancestors they might encounter there, as suggested by Andrew Fitzpatrick. So the consumption, either ritual or actual, of pork was clearly an important part of the chariot burial. All but one of the chariot burials found in Britain contain pig forequarters. Like I said, underneath the body was this amazing shield, and without doubt, it was one of the most significant pieces of Celtic art to be discovered this millennium. It was face down and also upside down. Mel Giles and I have suggested, and it's probably that we wrote about it in the monograph of the cemetery, I should say, that came out a couple of years ago. And we also wrote about the burial more generally in Prehistoric Yorkshire Journal, and that came out a few weeks ago, so you can read more about it there if you want to. So it's probable that the ponies were led down into the grave and killed where they were found, being positioned as though they were galloping by use of earth, kind of posing them as the grave was being backfilled. And this is really unusual, not least because ponies, especially those that are trained to lead a chariot, would have been highly valuable. Like the shield, it may have been the case that a bond was formed between the animals and the individual during life, that meant that they had to accompany him in death. This dramatic and rather gruesome spectacle would have marked another very poignant moment in the funeral theatrics. And the ritual killing of the animals may even have taken the place of the killing of objects that's more commonly known in warrior burials. So the body of the shield and the core of the boss were made from wood, and samples taken by Mags Felter from York Trust were examined using SEM, and they all proved to be ash, made from ash wood. It was clear from the staining in the soil that the wood grain ran horizontally across the shield rather than vertically along its length, which was perhaps surprising, but it was probably a deliberate choice to prevent the shield from easily splitting from an overhead blow. And it could also be why there's a great apparent concentration of clips along the side of the shield, which aren't pictured here. So this species of wood has a plastic and shock absorbent quality, which means it's well suited for shield construction. It's unclear whether the shield's made from planks or carved from a single piece of wood, but the clips on the edge reveal that it was about 7 to 11 mil thick. On the reverse of the shield, the presence of an organic substance was indicated by a dark staining, and it was tentatively identified as hide product, probably leather. The copper alloy components were all formed from sheet metal, which was cast and then beaten flat. It was beaten in from the back in a technique that's called repoussé. The Celtic motifs and the plaques and the tabs were then finished from the front using a chaser. You can see quite crude chasing marks on the front of the shield. So compared to the examples from the Thames, perhaps on North Yorkshire craftsperson wasn't quite as skilled as or accomplished, some might say, yeah. Similarly, the edges of the scallop border are kind of in places angular rather than curved, and these seem to be cut out a little bit less carefully than how the kind of main decoration's been executed. It has a puncture to one of the plaques on the front, and it was pretty forceful. So it's actually moved one of the plaques backwards. It's ripped a couple of the rivets out of position. So quite a significant blow to the front of the shield. And we argued that, again, this damage and repair is testament to both the defensive and offensive capabilities of the shield, and again demonstrating that these highly decorated objects weren't just reserved for ceremony and display, but actually saw action in battle. So this was the burial of a mature man who was exceptional in the community, who had been at some point on the wrong end of a sword, but probably survived that encounter. He was somebody that had clearly seen some action in his life, and this formed a part of an identity that led him to be given this really remarkable and dramatic send-off that was orchestrated and attended by a community who clearly had a great deal of respect for him. And this stands in stark contrast to the treatment and death of many other younger victims of violence that had been buried in the surrounding cemeteries. And just finally, I wanted to just comment a bit more on the idea of front and back. So shields in a wider sense are a category of object that lend themselves well to being decorated, not least by virtue of having relatively large flat surfaces. They're portable, they can be carried and in a sense worn. They can be used to negotiate space. They can be deployed as a barrier with the user on the inside and everybody else on the outside. We tend to pay, of course, a lot of attention to the front of shields, but it's important to think about the back as well. We've seen already apotropaic, there you go, motifs, protective motifs. On the front of shields, animal heads with staring eyes that are designed to turn away onlookers and are meant to be seen. But we also have hidden motifs that are protective as well, but work in a slightly different way. So this is the back of the completely metal Chertsey shield, and this one is actually the handle of the Battersea shield, which is not attached to the object anymore because there would have been wood in between. You can see that the Chertsey shield has a pair of kind of serpents. These may be similar to serpent pairs that you sometimes get on swords as well. I liken this figure to perhaps this kind of humanoid figure with a spindly neck and kind of head, and perhaps like a hooded field that's on one of these plaques from Wales. There's a kind of polarity in the shield that the shield creates here, a different kind of charge on the inside and the outside. There's physical in the space that it negotiates, but it's also psychological, both for the bearer and for those that are witnessing it. Some of the decorations meant to be effective and visible, whilst other parts are more hidden and personal. This model of positive and negative charge is also reflected in the burial record as well. Whenever we get shields in graves, if it's underneath the body, the shield's face down, but if it's on top of the body, the shield's face up. So it always has to go the right way around. So, bit of a whistle-stop tour, but just to sum everything up. So shields were a dynamic category of object that were primarily used to defend, but they were also capable of being used to pin, to choke, to bruise, or split skin. They also work psychologically, both on the bearer and the assailant. My study that appreciated them as assemblages of animals, plants, and metals contributed to the understanding of not just their practical use, but their material affordances and how they enhanced its apotropaic potency and enriched their symbolic meaning. In particular, the incorporation of animal hides into shields has led to a richer understanding of not just the oxide form, used to evoke a stretched skin and exaggerated through metal bindings, but the powers or properties being conjured through bovine byproducts, and also the symbolism hidden within Celtic shield art. The composite nature of the shield, in which fixtures and fittings, bosses and plaques and handles could be both added and taken off again, rendered it a particularly suitable visual field for more dynamic reconfigurations of symbolism and social connectedness. Shields were not merely a means of reflecting an identity that had already been arrived at, but were dynamic and experimental objects with which new associations could be projected through the addition of novel components. And just as a treat, I've gathered together my favorite images of warrior Celts from the internet, just to, get us in the mood from the pub. And that's it. Thank you. Right, it's not here.
Quick question. You said a couple of times you've got some favourites.
Mm.
Which one would you be your absolute most favourite shield?
It's a really difficult. My favourite one is the. I don't know. My favourite one is this one, I think, because it's undervalued. I would argue that it's understudied and undervalued in the literature, but it's really, really interesting because it has this, massive catalogue of damage. With the Bronze Age ones, I really should say I really like this this leather one. I forgot to say this before, but this Marta Diaz Guadamino pointed this out. This is actually a stealer from Spain, and at first people were like, is this like a map? Like, what is this? But it's actually the back of one of these shields. So this shield's from Ireland, but this is from Spain, and it's like almost an exact carbon copy of the back. Isn't that amazing? So this is really cool as well. I would have to say those two. Yeah. Oh. Right, don't make it too difficult. Come on.
What's it a picture of? Sorry, that's a private joke for you. I thought it was brilliant, and I learned more about Iron Age shields than I ever thought I could possibly have wanted to know. So thank you for that.
Probably more that you didn't want to know.
Yeah. My question is about, I suppose, about you've done really interesting stuff mapping different kind of elements of these shields, and it made me think of the way in which people have talked about affect a lot as I was going through. Like, people talk about affect as how bodies press into each other, and your shields like capture that literally. You've got the marks of in that leather one there where things have hit it and those sorts of things. And I was trying to like wrap out in my head like all the different kinds of ways we could map affects through these shields, through the symbolism, through the kind of the potencies of the animals, of the kind of the things they evoke, that notion of enchantment that you brought up really nicely, I thought, which obviously connects to like Chris Gosden and Duncan Garrow's work and stuff like that, doesn't it? And then the kind of the offensive and defensive affects, the way they press into the bodies. And so I suppose the question I was wondering is like, are there ways you can take a concept like affect and take this discussion of the shields further? Where would you go with that to kind of push that in a new direction, if you like, beyond the typological, beyond that, to think about them in new directions? And also, are there things that shields aren't being used for that they could be? Like, what's the kind of, if some of those affects are being made really real and are being used, what are the things that shields aren't being used for that they could be, all the materials that aren't being used in shields or not being connected with shields as well? Sorry, that's really long and winding, but it was really interesting and stimulating. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, I could have talked about like the materials, you know, for the whole 40 minutes if I wanted to, because it was something that I drew out in much more detail in my thesis, and it's also one of the key things that's come out of this that I want to. I mean, part of this lecture was like I want to get some more publications out of this. I've had enough time away from it now that I wanted to kind of consolidate and think about, you know, how I can get some papers out of this, and that's one of the you know, it's a big topic, but and yeah, I mean, typology is like, let's face it, quite boring, but it's just something that I had to do. But you know, so yeah, I think the way that materials reference each other is like really interesting. I know that Matt Beamish and his colleague who published on the organic shield that we had, for example, argued that the Battersea shield, the metal one that has that slightly wasted shape in the middle, was actually referencing the organic form, because when you put the kind of horizontal supports in the middle, when they were experimenting with, you know, making replicas, that the way that it dried out would naturally give the wooden ones that shape in the middle. So I think there's definitely a lot to be drawn out about experimenting with materials, referencing different materials, and kind of trying to, in a way, like evoke sort of material affordances with different materials. So more, I mean, natural forms, I know it's not the right word for it, but you know, being replicated in different materials. I think that's really interesting. In terms of what they were used for, I mean, really, I think that shield, in terms of the martial panoply, like the shield was probably the, you know, one of the most important things. You know, you could use it for like shelter, you could use it for, you know, it could be have lots of different applications. I think a really interesting one as well is like for, you know, it being like a locus for like oral history. You can imagine like the shield being at the side of a fire, and the light kind of dancing across it, and it being, you know, its history being kind of like brought out. So I think it being, you know, you know, they're pretty big, so it can be a kind of focus for that kind of social, and you know, interconnectedness and the telling of stories and shared group histories and stuff. So I think that, you know, that's something that we don't see in the record really, but that's missing, that I wanted to bring back into it. I started to do like a little comic strip about that. I did like a graphic novel style thing, which I can show you later if you like. Does that answer some? I mean, I do want to explore this more. So I mean, let's chat. So.
Thanks, that was really, really interesting paper. I've just got a very, very simple question, and that's about regionality. Is there any regionality in the typology of the shields, or in the depositional context?
Yeah, there is. So in mortuary context, most of the burial records are from Yorkshire, of course, and we only get kind of dotted record. I'll go back to where was it before now? The hide-shaped shields have got very much like a southeastern concentration, so they probably had more of a continental relationship. We have like the umbos with the flared wings. They're from these burials down south, so they're like very southern as well. In North Yorkshire, in North and East Yorkshire, we have some really distinctive types of shield that have two plaques either side. So the shield from the chariot burial that I showed you, and also the Grimthorpe shield, the kind of mix and match one, have that same kind of style of boss cover. So they're very distinctive as well. Also the Welsh shields, there's a really important kind of motif called the pelter, which is like an arc on the outside with two arcs in the middle. So the pelter was really important, particularly with Welsh shields. So pretty much, well, most of the Welsh shields that we have like pelter shaped boss covers. So that there's a very distinct, I bring out those in the thesis, bring out those like very specific regional typologies as well. So yeah, we definitely do see like very distinctive regional variations of shields.
And are some types deposited in particular contexts, or is it more to do with the geographical region in which?
Yeah, they are. So the bronze-faced shields, for example, we only find in river context. There's no burials from them. The Welsh shields are all kind of stray finds or ones from a watery context, and then the Yorkshire ones all come from graves. So yeah, there does seem to be some correlation. I mean, in lots of areas we really don't have a lot of evidence. In fact, lots of the hide-shaped bits of binding mainly come from hill forts. So that seems like a particularly kind of martial, maybe a bit more mass produced. They're the most abundant type because we get lots of binding that has like the distinctive knob on the side. I just said distinctive knob, sorry. But yeah, so they come from hill forts. Yeah, so yes.
I think we just have a quick one online. And it is there any reason why people are buried on their shield or under them?
So I mean, traditionally it's seen as part of a kind of martial warrior burial, weapons burial. In a way, it helped to kind of frame the body. It may have been, particularly with the chariot burial, a kind of part of the martial ceremony. Maybe they were laid on the shield first and kind of placed into the grave or into the box of the chariot. You know, it might have been a kind of a way of transporting the body in the first instance. In other ways, when the shield's kind of on top, it may have been a kind of form of closure almost. So the funerary procession goes along, and then the deposition of the shield into the grave is almost like a kind of veil that removes the deceased from like the world of the living. So there's some practical explanations. There's some kind of more spiritual ritual explanations. Yeah. Sometimes it was again this ritual destruction of objects before they get deposited that is a wider theme. So a dramatic kind of moment in the funerary rite. So yeah, lots of different possibilities.
Thank you. We got Alex and Kevin.
Kind of along similar lines. So it's really interesting that you're saying about the kind of the individuals here as kind of deictic centers, so the shield is still being laid out kind of facing the right way in relation to the bodies. And I had two small questions there. You mentioned that one of these shields is kind of you've determined is upside down. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the significance of that. But then also in relation to the grave finds, are there any instances where shields aren't kept together as coherent objects in relation to the people, like where they're maybe fragmented and scattered, or are they consistently kept in this kind of coherent object shape?
Yeah, so basically Mel and I just decided which way up the shield went. We just, looking at the way that the handle was situated, the way that one of the spines is slightly longer than the other one, we decided that was probably which way up it went. So we don't 100% know that it was upside down, but it was certainly like placed the right way in the grave. What was the other part of the question? Sorry. Oh yeah, so in most cases, as far as we can see, like the whole shield was interred, but because the bosses were made from metal and the bodies were, the boards of the shield were organic, we don't get a lot of the boards being preserved. So whether they were really deposited as whole shields or whether the board was removed first and then put into the grave, it's difficult to say in lots of cases. So it is definitely possible that there was some fragmentation before deposition. But like in the example I showed you, the shield that was placed over the top, it seems like it was a kind of act that was performed just at the graveside, and it was kind of part of the funeral ceremony, and kind of like the whole shield gets interred. Actually, there's a couple of like later burials. One that's on display in the British Museum that has a boss that's like separate, but it has like Roman amphora in it and stuff like that. So yeah, that has a boss in it that's separate from the shield actually. But yeah, but usually it's the whole shield as far as we can see.
Thanks for the talk. My questions were, you talked about the shields will sometimes have apotropaic designs on the outward face and protective or comforting designs on the inward face.
Whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about what it is in an Iron Age world that makes a design apotropaic or comforting.
I think mainly it's about visibility. So the ones on the front were made to be seen. Often it was like an animal that had wider importance to Iron Age life. So the cow was really important. Like dairy was really important. They consumed a lot of dairy products. Particularly in important times like funerary feast, the animals were slaughtered for their meat. Their hides would be used to make the shields and lots of other things, of course. So part of it was like the importance of the animal. I think that evoking like particular animal behaviors was important. And I think in the more hidden ones, the ones that are often called dragon pairs, that's when we tend to see perhaps more kind of fantastical hybrids, animals that were perhaps mixing with vegetal forms even, or it's a mixture of some animal parts and other ones. So that's perhaps more in the kind of realm of spiritual beliefs that might the assailant or whatever can't see it, but it's there, and it's it gives you comfort in that way. But yeah, it's about, I think they work in different ways because of how visible they are, really. Yeah. What's that answer? Yeah.
Actually, really quick follow-up.
Mhm.
You make it the fact that the shield on the Spanish stela, I know I'm still thinking of the Bronze Age, faces into the stone.
Yes, yeah, that's interesting, yeah. I know it's weird that it's the back of it rather than the front. Yeah. And the little arrows point to where the handle is, so yeah.
Right, perfect, thank you. We are running out of time, so we've just got 2 quick questions online. First is, does Matt see any significance in the near total lack of shield fittings from East Anglia, considering the quantity of other metalwork types from that part of the country?
Yeah, it is really interesting, isn't it? I mean, we're working on like a couple of shields from East Anglia, a couple of swords from East Anglia at the moment. So yeah, there probably is. There's like one burial, one possible hoard that has like a shield bit in, but yeah, generally a lack. And I think perhaps a lot of that is to do with the way that bodies are being deposited, that we just don't really get any burials from there. So perhaps it was more of a kind of deposition into water type thing. But even so, I mean, we've seen from like Must Farm that things that are deposited into rivers do tend to kind of sink down and become preserved. So yeah, I do think there's definitely a significance there. Maybe shield use was less of a tradition in East Anglia compared to the rest of the other parts of the country. So yeah, I do think that.
Perfect. And final comment. I wonder what evidence for the curving shape of shields you came across. The nick out of the edge of the leather circular shields might relate to a concave convex shape. So much of what we find is either squashed flat or folded up. We don't often get a window into the third dimension.
Yeah, I would say that's fair.
Nice little comment.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, perfect. I think we're done then. So another round of applause for Matt.
Thank you.